Just disappeared.
Are you in the group? I can add you.
So we were. Close the door or leave it open?
Let's leave it open. There's going to be maybe 4 or 5 more people. Are y'all about ready?
Yeah, we should start.
Okay, let's get it.
I love sports.
Okay. All right, everybody. Thank you so much for coming out. My name's Adam. I'm going to be moderating the panel. And I just want to do a couple quick minutes of introductions, introduce the event, and then we'll get right into talking with our speakers. So this event, Careers in Public Lands and Why They Matter, we're really excited about it. It's a partnership between the Getches-Wilkinson Center. It's a research center upstairs, which really tries to act as a bridge between the practicing world of environmental and natural resources law and the student body at CU. And I also want to introduce Chris Winter, who's the new executive director of the GWC. So we're very happy to have Chris, very lucky to have Chris, and we're very optimistic about what the GWC will be doing in the years to come. It's also in partnership with the Weiss Foundation, which is a large charitable foundation that supports a ton of initiatives, one of them being land conservation, both public and private. They have a really generous scholarship, which I'm lucky to be the recipient of for this year. So we'll mention that more and encourage you all to apply, but they're doing a lot of good work out there for public lands. And so what we were hoping to do with this event is introduce people to the field of public land law. And I think a lot of folks don't necessarily know exactly what public land law is, and that's okay, because it can be a lot of different things. And something that I think is interesting is that all these other fields that many of us know and care about, natural resources being like energy, oil and gas, hard rock mining, timber, whatnot, you know, everywhere to clean energy, environmental justice, all of these other things, all of these overlap with public land law. And of course, this is way too simplistic of a slide, right? Because all of those fields overlap with each other too. But the point being, hopefully through the speakers, you'll be able to see that there's a place for everybody in this field. And even if you want to just take a little bite out of the side of it, that's totally okay. And before we dive in, I just want to do a quick comment on the field of public lands as it relates to American Indian law and Native peoples. So for some, just the term public lands is problematic, and the idea of public lands could be problematic. And, you know, the university is on the traditional lands of the Cheyenne, Ute, Arapaho, and several other tribes, I believe 48 current tribes in the state of Colorado as of today, registered tribes. And we're not going to fix that legacy right now, but a cool thing about the field of public land law is it allows us to engage very directly with some of these issues around Indigenous peoples' law and the state of the world today and how we'd like it to be. And so one of the ways that we can put that into action today is by having our speakers tell us about how they engage with Indigenous peoples in their work every day. So just wanted to do a brief comment on that. And with that, I'd like to hand it over to our speakers. Go ahead, and we've got Roger Flynn, Scott Miller, and Michelle is coming down from SUA. And I'll just let everybody introduce themselves because you'll do a far better job than myself. But this is a group of really distinguished CU Law alumni that we're really appreciative to have here today. So, Roger, why don't you go ahead and start, and we'll just go this way.
Hey, folks, Roger Flynn. I'm class of 91, and since 93, I'm the director of something called the Western Mining Action Project. It's a nonprofit public interest law firm that we focus on hard rock mining in the West. Me and another guy, Jeff Parsons, class of 98. He's been with me since 99. It's just us two. And, you know, that is a great Venn diagram, so to speak, because, you know, even though, you just do mining law, the 1872 mining law. Oh, by the way, I hope each one of you will be in my class in the spring, mining and mineral law development, which is just not just hard rock, but we also do oil and gas and coal and a bunch of other cool stuff. And I would put all those outside ones, scrunch them in more, because when you're dealing with public land law, you really have everything goes together. So we just do mining. We represent environmental groups and Indian tribes. You know, Adam was saying that some of you have taken American Indian law. You know the great case of U.S. versus Dan, Carrie and Mary Dan, and they were Western Shoshone elders that we represented fighting mines in Nevada for many years. And I said, well, talking to Carrie, who's since passed on, I said, well, that's BLM land over there. She goes, Roger, that's not BLM land. That's Western Shoshone land. I said, I know, but the Supreme Court said otherwise. So it is a very interesting issue, and it's probably the honor of my career to work with tribes around the West. Just a little bit about me. My undergraduate was engineering back east. In college, I worked in the aerospace industry for 4 years and hated every day of it. And then I just so I chucked it all. Spent 4 months on the Pacific Crest Trail, and I came to see you, like probably many of you did, because it is one of the top, and still is. It was easier to get into back in '88. I think there's no way I could get in to see you with my college grades. But I would come out and follow the Grateful Dead out through the West, and I said, I'm moving out West. If you've seen the Grateful Dead at Red Rocks in the '80s, you can never leave. And so I just, another honor of my life was working as Charles Wilkinson's assistant. Research assistant in law school, and that just was one of it. It was just so great. And so I worked for a couple groups in Boulder out of law school. They had money for a year, and money ran out, and I started my own thing. And luckily was able to get some grant money. We're still funded by grants and stuff. But public land mining is really what we do. Jeff works on some state issues, but mostly I sue the BLM and the Forest Service for approving mines that our clients don't want. And so we worked with Wilderness Society and SUA. We just actually sort of won a case. We threatened the BLM, and they backed off, and the company backed off. It was a combination of endangered species law, mining law, national monument law, and stuff like that. So it all rolls together, and it's just I love. And you get to the nice thing about public land law is you get to go out in the public lands. You go visit these cool places up in Montana or down in Indian country in Arizona or something like that, and it's just wonderful. So I feel free if I guess we'll have our emails out there. So maybe after the conference, if anyone has a question about this, feel free. Because a lot of my mentors helped me when I was in your shoes, and I just want to repay that debt I owed to Charles and some other folks. So. Guess I'll pass it to Scott.
All right, great. Hi, I'm Scott Miller. I'm the Regional Director for the Wilderness Society. And I'll tell you a couple things. One, I do get to backpack and hike for work, which is great. It's not the only great part of my job. But yeah, as Roger's saying, working on public lands, if you like to be out on the land, it's the place to be for your career. I'll tell you a little bit about my career path because it reflects the importance of this diagram. Also, as Roger had said, I started in conservation biology, field work, and eventually decided to go to law school, where I went here, graduated in '98. And then I went to the solicitor's office in the Department of the Interior, which is like the general counsel's office for the Department of the Interior, where I practice Indian law, particularly Indian Reserve water rights law. From there, I went to the U.S. Senate and worked for the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee, where I did public land law with a focus on BLM and forest work, and then came to the Wilderness Society. And there's really not a day that goes by where I don't use my conservation biology, my Indian law background, my water law background, as well as my legislative background. It is, well represented, maybe not perfectly as everyone recognized here, but I mention that because your career will take different paths, and they are all tied together for me, which works out really well. And that was because of my interest in these things. But your career can take that path and adds up to something as you go through. That thread will stick with you, and it's great if you can combine those threads into the sweater that is my job now, or something like that, which I really enjoy getting to weave all those things together. And as far as my day-to-day work, a lot of people in the Wilderness Society and around the conservation community rely on me to bring those unique perspectives to our work, just like everyone in the organization has unique perspectives from their career. And so I do a range of things. I do a lot of legislative work. I draft a lot of legislation, do a lot of legislative strategy. Water issues come up. I'm kind of the guy for the Wilderness Society. I work on our legal team, and I work on place-based initiatives where we're working with communities to protect public lands. Do you have the slide on TWS? There's a lot here, and I hope I'm not blocking too much of it, but the Wilderness Society was founded in 1935 by a number of visionaries, including Aldo Leopold and Bob Marshall, that had a vision to protect some federal public lands in their natural undeveloped state. And really that was the focus of the organization's work for decades, leading up to our executive director drafting and really shepherding through the Wilderness Act through Congress in 1964, which established the National Wilderness Preservation System. And since then, we've really broadened our focus. And the way I think about wilderness today at the Wilderness Society is it's one tool in the toolbox of public land conservation. And so we work on wildlife refuges. We work on national monuments. We work on land management planning. We work on RS 2477, which Michelle will tell you about. And we still work on wilderness. And you can see down here, sorry, I'm in the way, I'm too tall, or my chair is, but public land conservation is a focus. Climate change is a focus. You may or may not know that almost a quarter of all the fossil fuel emissions from the United States originate on our public lands through oil, gas, and coal work. So we work to reduce the emissions that originate from our public lands resources, as well as advancing renewable energy development on public lands in the right places. Building a critical mass of people. If we're going to conserve our public lands and even retain our public lands, people need to know about them and care about them. So we work on that. And equitable benefits, as Adam alluded to, there's a lot of inequity in the management and history of our public lands, and we work to address that. And then finally, full funding. Our public lands have been significantly underfunded for a number of decades. We worked a lot in the last Congress on a number of bills that really did give our public lands a significant injection of funding for the first time in a generation, and hopefully not the last time in a generation. So that's generally what the Wilderness Society does and what I do for the Wilderness Society. Michelle?
So I'm Michelle White, and I don't have enough of a career to have a sweater yet, but maybe one day I will be warm. So I graduated from CU in 2017, and essentially since then have worked for the Southern Utah Wilderness Alliance. So we're a little bit different from the Wilderness Society in that we're focused specifically on Utah, and we're focused on getting more wilderness protection, not just maintaining current wilderness in its natural state. So SUA's driving force has always been America's Red Rock Wilderness Act, which is a bill that has been introduced every new Congress since around SUA's founding in 1983. And the goal of that is to get around 9 million acres of additional wilderness protection in the state of Utah. So until that happens, we work to conserve, essentially, the landscapes in their natural state so that they can be eligible for wilderness protection. So the two issues, so my colleagues work more on like the oil and gas, the hard rock mining. So my colleagues who worked with Roger to get the win he was just talking about. And then what I focus on is a really niche area of law. I think that's a fair way to describe it. It has to do with claimed rights of way. about 10 years ago, the state of Utah filed 12,000 claims in 20 cases in federal district court. Almost none of them have been settled yet. I think they have 5 adjudicated rights out of their 12,000. So if you, I think, go to the next slide. So that on the left is what we like to call the spaghetti map. So those are the claims, right? This is pretty high level. This is the entire state of Utah. These are some of the claims. This is a truck stuck in the North Swag, which is a adjudicated public highway. And I believe this is Grand Bench Neck, which is down by the Colorado River near the Glen Canyon National Recreation Area. That is in litigation currently. Not all their claims are like this. Some of them are maintained, graded roads you could drive a two-wheel drive vehicle on. A lot of their claims look like this. So that's the concern that we have. So if you want to go to the next slide. So just to give you an idea, this is just a zoomed in portion of San Juan County. So right, each of the squares represents a mile. And this is just a zoomed in example of how many claims that they have, how dense their claims can be. And I think if you just go to the next slide, this is a slightly different example that is just trying to illustrate the point that there are a lot of primitive and not well maintained, not what you would think of as like a highway, or that you could drive in a normal like two-wheel drive vehicle. Sometimes you need an OHV at this point, Jeep to drive them. So what this shows is that just west of Arches National Park, this is the network of roads. The red shows everywhere that you're a mile, less than a mile, half a mile away from a road. The yellow is a mile, and then there's a little bit of orange up in that corner. It's a little hard to see on the screen, and that's more than a mile away from a road. So you can see how roads really can have a large impact on landscapes by fragmenting them. They impact riparian areas, they have impact on wildlife. So these claimed rights-of-way are throughout some of the most sensitive areas in the state and just have a really big impact on our ability to conserve landscapes. Thanks, Scott. Sorry.
Yeah, thanks everybody. Okay, cool. So what we're going to do is we've got a couple pre-prepared questions that I'm going to ask of the speakers, and then we'll save the last 10 minutes or so for questions from the audience. So we'll just jump right into that. So building off of what you just explained about your job and your organization, what is public land for you, and how does your work relate to what that means?
All right. Do you want to throw up the map now?
Yeah.
So the term public land is ambiguous. For some people it means their local park. When we talk about federal public lands, we're talking about much of what you're seeing on the map here, which are which comprise about a third of the land in the United States, owned by the federal government. And specifically, I think for purpose of this discussion, when we talk about our public lands or federal public land law, we're talking about lands that are managed by the 4 primary land management agencies. That would be the Bureau of Land Management, that would be our national forests, which are the lands in green here. The BLM lands are the yellow lands. That would be our national parks, which are in the dark green. You can see Yellowstone up there in northwest Wyoming. And what am I forgetting? BLM, Forest Service, refuges.
Some defense projects.
The refuges are the 4th one, managed by the Fish and Wildlife Service. Also on this map, you'll see defense lands in blue and Indian lands in red. We're typically not talking about those when we talk about federal public land law, but as the Venn diagram indicated, you can't do federal public land law without understanding American Indian law and understanding the history and the law of land management for those Indian lands, as well as the defense lands, et cetera. There are also offshore lands that the United States owns and manages for oil and gas. You might define those as federal public land law or not, but I think primarily what we're talking about are these green, orange, dark green, and yellow lands managed by those land management agencies. And you can see they're concentrated in the West, but they're not limited to the West. If you're working on any land or natural resource issue in the West, you're inevitably going to work on federal public land law. If it's a water rights issue, you've got a private water rights client, you're going to have to understand federal public land law. Oil and gas, renewable energy. You can't do anything in the West, almost, without intersecting with the management of our public lands. And so in the East, too, much more scattered because of the history of the development of our public lands, but there are two really significant public land issues scattered around the rest of the country. I should mention Alaska, also heavily public land dominated. So the field of public lands public land law is focused on the management of the lands and resources on our public lands, as I've defined it. So does that answer your question?
That's great. And as we'll hopefully see here, public lands can mean more than one thing. So with that, we'll go to Roger.
Okay, we've all mentioned this word history, and I should have been a history major. That's what I like reading and stuff like that. The history of public lands, that's one of the things you really got to know, because what I do, we just probably the biggest win of our career last year in the Ninth Circuit was, what was Congress meant by this word in 1872? Not 1972, not 2022. What was the country up to in 1872? Thankfully, 2-1, the Ninth Circuit agreed with me. And then the Interior Department has changed its entire policy now because of that case. So understanding the history of all this stuff is incredibly important. But for us lawyers, it oftentimes gets into specialty areas. Now, for example, the National Forests have some laws that we deal with, like if you've taken environmental law or something, and you have National Environmental Policy Act, the NEPA, that requires you to do environmental impact reviews for projects that the feds authorize. That applies to all federal agencies. And some federal land laws, like, the Clean Water Act will apply the same to BLM. Basically, the yellow and the green is where a lot of the battles are. I've had maybe one mining case in a new national park that was created. But the mining companies since 1872, can't go into Yellowstone. So it's mostly the green and the yellow where the real litigation goes. And that's what we do. We sue the Forest Service and the BLM. But the Forest Service laws are different. The first Forest Service law was enacted by Congress really in 1897. The first time the BLM had a law that Congress said, here's what you got to do to manage for what we call multiple use was 1976. Prior to 1976, it was almost a free-for-all on BLM lands. There were some grazing regulations in the 1930s started, but mining, it was a free-for-all. Forest Service had some regulations. And so when you take public land law, which probably most of you will, you'll have a chapter the way Charles Wilkinson set it up when he originally wrote the first, but now it's the seventh draft or whatever, seventh edition. You have a big chapter on timber. What are the laws dealing with timber? They're very different from mining. Then you have a chapter on mining. Then you have a chapter on water, on how it relates to federal land law. You have a chapter on grazing. You have a chapter on sort of protected lands like wilderness or national parks and stuff like that. And so you have to, that Venn diagram, it's interesting when the mining industry in the PR battles, they'll say, we are the most heavily regulated industry in the country. And I'm like, that's right. This is my personal, because you're the most destructive. You're going to wipe out wildlife. You're going to wipe out cultural resources. You're probably going to pollute the water. Not every mining company. For those watching on the Great Wide World Web, you're going to maybe be, you could be on Forest Service land. You could be on BLM land. You could be on both. So you really have to know everything. And you have tribal sacred sites there. Indian law on the red is when you take Indian law, and CU is still one of the best college law schools on Indian law. You know, that deals with tribal sovereignty and stuff like that. But what about tribal rights on the yellow and the green? That's what we deal with because Indian tribes have sovereignty. So if they don't want to mine a coal mine or a gold mine or something or oil and gas, they can just say no. But they don't have veto authority or sovereignty, full sovereignty on the yellow and the green. And so we'll be representing trying to protect their sacred sites that are on BLM land. And it's a tough road. The law is not in favor, you know, it is not set up to stop development. So what the public land law, so that's where Wilderness Society comes in, and what Sue is fighting for is they'll say, well, you want to stop development, stop oil and gas mining, logging, whatever, go get a national park, go get a wilderness site. Otherwise, all the yellow and the green that's not in national parks and wilderness and stuff like that, or, you know, national monuments. So this, now we have Grand Staircase, Escalante here, and then a lot of this is now Bears Ears and stuff that, as you know, Biden created Bears Ears, Trump cut it, Biden put it back, excuse me, Obama in the original time. And so most of the battles are on the unprotected lands. So the conservation community obviously wants more protected lands because the 1872 mining law doesn't apply in a wilderness area. There's some exceptions that I'll tell you in class in the spring. But and so it really is the thing about public land law when you do it, when you study it, and then you do it out in the field, you really got to know a lot. So, you know, we just, yesterday we lost a case in the District of Arizona. I'm writing the notice of appeal just before I came here, trying to stop mining exploration down here on the Coronado. But the week before, we won a case in the Ninth Circuit. I argued it on Thursday the 25th. On the 26th, they issued an order overturning the district court, stopping the project. Some really great mining right on the edge of the Sierras. If you've ever been on the east side of the Sierras, it's one of the most spectacular areas in the West. And so, you know, you win and lose. And one of the things, just as a general lawyer advice, is you lose, you know, and you win. So you got to sort of have an even keel. And Roger, you have a lot of experience. I go, a lot of battle scars, because I've, you know, when you take admin law that Michelle's going to talk about, administrative law. You know, the odds are stacked against anyone who sues. Maybe you're going to represent an oil and gas company or something like that. Suing the federal government or the EPA for giving you strict regulations you don't like, the deference given to the agencies is tough. I always say you usually start out in the baseball analogy with 2 strikes against you. So you lose. It's tough. But when you win, boy, it does feel great. And particularly when it's public land. You protected a place. You know, I have sort of in the back of my brain the places that are now protected because of our work, and it really just I don't have a job really. This is my vocation, you know, and I don't have a job. I just love it. And so when you can think about the indigenous communities or small communities whose water supply you've protected, or their sacred land, their religion you've helped protect, or a tree, or an owl, or a salmon. Boy, it is one of the most rewarding things. All I can ask, or hope that if some of you can have the joy that I've had working on all these areas for so many different and wonderful people. It's just wonderful. You know, I wish that I just hope. I know many of you are going to do better than us combined, right? And so that's what I wish for your future on this, because it is just a wonderful field. It's just so broad. It's just so rewarding.
I might just add, if I could, you know, the breadth and the depth of public lands. You know, we're talking about multiple volumes of the United States Code are dedicated to public lands, and then a bookshelf full of regulations, and then a room full of policies and manuals and all that sort of thing. And one of the things that really is interesting about public land law, as you may have gathered from Roger's comments here, is that it is this really interesting mix of older and new laws. So 1872 mining law, still, like, you have to understand those words today, and that law and the understanding of it in our in public land law is changing significantly today from what folks were thinking it meant 20 years ago, or maybe that's not the perfect way to describe that, but the field continues to evolve 150 years later. I'm working on old growth protection policies for federal lands, and going back and looking at the 1897 Organic Act, as well as the National Forest Management Act of 1976, as well as executive orders from last year. And so, part of being a good public land lawyer is understanding that all those volumes up on the shelf, but also being able to weave them all together in a way that can advance your interests.
Awesome. Thanks. Take it away, Michelle.
So when I was thinking about this question, I had no doubt that Scott and Roger would give you the great explanation about what public lands are and the patchwork of laws and the long history of laws that you have to understand to practice specifically public land law. But I come at it from a slightly different perspective, which is that you not only need to understand this patchwork of public land specific laws, you absolutely have to understand administrative law. I think that about half of the brief that I write at any given time is educating judges on how administrative law works and how that factors into their analysis. So I think that just succinctly, I would absolutely encourage all of you to get as much exposure to administrative law if you think about going into public land law, because it's complicated. Not a lot of judges, or not all judges, have a background in it, and it really impacts how you have to frame issues for the judge.
I might just add on admin law, we think it's coming in the next year or two. Maybe there's a case on the docket. The U.S., we've been living under, if you've taken admin law, there's something called the Chevron doctrine, which a tie goes to the agency. Anything close to a tie goes to the agency on interpreting the regulations and the statutes. But, some in the business community don't like that. We don't like it either because that's how we lose. They don't like it because that's how they lose. And so there is one case, there may be another one or two coming, where this Supreme Court, as you know, lots on the table. This precedent isn't as strong as we thought it was. So the Chevron doctrine of great deference to the agencies is on the table either sooner or later. And so that's good. Environmentalists are going to win more. Yeah, maybe, but industry's going to win more. And so keep your eyes open for that. So you think, it sounds dry. Admin law. Who cares about that? I want to take civil rights law or, Native American Indian law. You got to take admin law because that's where the nuts and bolts are, because you're going to be dealing with that in every case. Chevron deference. It's going to be interesting.
Part of administrative law, too, we have a couple litigators here, not here, but in order to win a case, you have to have a record that you can win on. And so a lot of what we do at the Wilderness Society is work through those administrative processes from the beginning to the end when there's a decision, and you have to understand administrative law through all of that process. You have a land management plan that the agency's putting together. You've got to be there commenting. You've got to figure out how to build the record so you can have the option to go to court at the end of the day. If you don't do that from the very beginning, we'll talk to Roger and Michelle, and they'll say, sorry, we can't help you because we don't have the record we need to work with.
That reminds me, I know this is jumping ahead a little bit about career paths and stuff like that. You're all thinking, I'm going to be a litigator like this, or, the best job I thought when I was in law school was regional director of the Wilderness Society, Darryl Knufke's job, right? I was like, that's the job.
It still is.
It still is, right, yeah. We'll arm wrestle. We both have the best jobs. Well, Michelle, is you don't or do cast a wide net. Some of my students here, 10, 12 years ago, they started out with environmental groups, not as litigators, but working on the public land specialists for this XYZ group. And they are the ones that are putting together the documents, and they learn what's going on from the ground up. What documents are we going to get to the agency so our lawyers can eventually use it in court? Because if you don't get it to the agency, I can't use it in court. And so don't say, if I don't get a staff attorney with, Sue or something like that, there's no jobs out there. So if you can start, you might start small with an environmental group. That is a way for you to get a couple of years under your belt, and then if you want to be a true litigator, they come along, and then you know NEPA and the mining law and the forest service laws or water rights, because that's what your group worked on. So keep a wide net, because the groups on the ground, that's who we represent. Michelle's she works with SUA and represents SUA. We represent SUA, and then 30 other
the
groups.
Wilderness Society.
Oh, that's true. Right. And so you have all these. The clients are the one we work for, whether it's a tribe or an environmental group. And so don't not look for those kind of jobs starting out, because it's tough to break into the field. Obviously, there's just so many jobs out there because of the funding and things like that. So you'll be working on these admin law issues as the staff conservation associate for the, save the salmon river or whatever it is. Great job. Get that job if you have a chance for that. And then you can, who knows, you may love just doing that, go salmon fishing the rest of your life. So, sorry, I jumped ahead a little bit on that, but I just wanted to forget.
That's great. Everybody wants to know how to get a job. Speak for the room here, I think, on that one. Okay, so for our next question, we're going to start with Michelle, and we would like to hear about a key issue that you work on, and why it's important to you.
Sure. So I think you go to the very last slide there. So obviously the bulk of my job, don't get me wrong, is working on RS-2477, but I've also been able to be a little bit involved in a more current issue that I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with and interested to know more about. But it has to do with the two monuments, some of the monuments in Utah, the Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument, which was first established by President Clinton in 1966. And this is sort of central southern Utah. And then, of course, there's Bears Ears National Monument, which was first established by President Obama just as he was leaving office. And that is in southeastern San Juan County, Utah. And so, for those of you who don't know the history, the monuments were established under the Antiquities Act of 1906, so another history lesson. And when President Trump came into office, he pretty promptly slashed the monuments. I think there's no other way to put it, really. So the yellow is the footprint of the light yellow is the footprint of the monuments as they were originally established, and the sort of more orangey colored is the footprint of the monument after Trump changed their boundaries. So that has a lengthy history. There's a ongoing lawsuit in the District of DC where environmental groups and some archaeologists, biologists, other folks sued to argue that President Trump did not have that authority under the Antiquities Act, because the Antiquities Act gives a president the authority to establish monuments. It doesn't say anything about the authority to diminish monuments. And then, of course, when President Biden came into office, he reestablished the boundaries of both of the monuments and actually added some acreage to the Bears Ears National Monuments. So I think that it's really a topical issue, I guess. A lot of people really care about these monuments, and there's been a lot of attention. I think there's a lot of press around those. And it matters because when a monument is established, fundamentally what it does is take those lands out of the multiple use framework that the agencies are used to working with, and tells the agency to prioritize monument objects. So that can be anything from paleontological interests, it can be artifacts, cultural resources, right? So the Bears Ears National Monument in particular was something that Tribal Coalition pushed for and really wanted it as a mechanism for protecting ancestral lands and the resources that they have available there. This does tie into, believe it or not, the RS-2477 rights-of-way that I work on because there are really dense claims in both of these monuments in terms of the network of claimed rights-of-way. So it's difficult to protect, for example, an archaeological resource if you have a road driving right through it, or if you have roads even that are nearby and very accessible. I mean, You drive on the roads around Colorado, Utah's worse, but people don't obey the laws. Here, where there's actual traffic enforcement, if you have people, with off-road vehicles that can go anywhere in the backcountry where there's no meaningful enforcement, you end up with a lot of degradation to the lands, a lot of archaeological damage, things like that. So, the monuments lawsuit is now being appealed. The Utah litigation over President Biden's reestablishment of the monuments is currently on appeal at the 10th Circuit. And the briefing is ongoing, but I imagine that the 10th Circuit will hear that early next year. So.
Yeah, I might just add a little bit, talking about old statutes and words and what they mean. There's the Antiquities Act, which provides the president authority to designate national monuments to protect objects of historic and scientific interest on the lands that are the smallest area compatible with the proper care and management of those objects. That's a 1906 law. We've got 120 years of case law that basically say, what do those dozen words mean? Whatever the president thinks they mean is the short of what the case law is. For the first time, really, in 120 years, Utah is putting a lot of effort into saying, no, that's not what those words mean. They mean X, Y, and Z, very specific things. And we've got this litigation which will determine the scope of the Antiquities Act and the future of national monuments on public lands, potentially in a dramatically different way than we've understood them for 120 years. Hopefully not. But Utah is committed to taking this all the way to the Supreme Court. And so getting to work on that is pretty exciting. One of the things I love about my job is I'm doing a couple dozen different things every week. I'll mention just a couple things to give you a sense of what I do in Colorado. The Southwest region for the Wilderness Society, which I oversee, is the Four Corner states in Nevada. And we've got lots going on in every state. I also do a lot of national work as well. But for example, we're working on a campaign, we call it an initiative, to protect the Dolores River country in southwest Colorado. And it's complicated. We've been working with communities there for over a decade on a vision for conservation for the Dolores River and its really special, spectacular canyons down there. Senator Bennett has a bill that I helped draft that is up for a hearing later this month. Meanwhile, just out of nowhere, we've got a uranium company that showed up and has designs for doing some significant mining in and around the National Conservation Area that we're proposing.
I don't think so. I'll stick Jeff on him.
So I've been spending a lot of time the last couple of weeks, talking about mining law and what is a valid existing right on a mining claim and what isn't, and what happens if you do create a withdrawal from mining and what happens to those mining claims. And meanwhile, there's also designs to create a big national monument out there in the Dolores country. So working through the legal issues, what are the objects of scientific and historic interest out there that could convince a president to create a national monument? How does that relate to the legislation that is pending? In one sense, the legislation shows congressional interest in protection that may convince the president that, yeah, this must be a special place. Look, Congress is having hearings on how to protect this area. At the same time, a monument is different and in some ways scarier than legislation because you don't read the proclamation until after it's signed. And so there's a lot of strategy about how to work with the administration on a monument, how to work with Congress on a legislative initiative, and how to work with stakeholders on the ground to try and create enough support to do one or the other or both. So that's an example of what I'm doing. A little bit of mining law, a a little bit of monuments law, a little bit of writing the law, and figuring out the strategy for all of that. Similar to the Dolores country, we have legislation scattered around the whole state called the Colorado Outdoor Recreation and Economy Act, the CORE Act, which would designate some wilderness areas and other areas from Summit and Eagle County to Gunnison, San Juan counties. And it was working on that legislation that when Senator Bennett was running for re-election, decided to call in a favor to the White House, and we ended up with Camp Hale Continental Divide National Monument up around Breckenridge, Vail, Ski Cooper, etc. And so, you know, a lot of times you work on these things and all these other issues come up. And we're also working on another big bill in Gunnison County, which has been really exciting. We're working with the summer motorized, off-road vehicle crews, the snowmobilers, the ranchers, the water users, the county commissioners, conservationists, to craft a vision for public land management and conservation throughout that county. And we've got all those groups been working together for years. And you can imagine Gunnison Crested Butte, about 4 hours from here, 4 or 5 hours from here. And it's a small community that everyone in that community loves their public lands. It's beautiful land. They love them to recreate on. They love them to ranch on. It's a part of the culture and the fabric of that community. And it used to be that, you know, if you wanted to ski in Crested Butte, gosh, that was 4 hours away. Now you want to ski at Keystone, it's also 4 hours away, right, on the weekend, as you know. And they're just seeing the Front Range, this tidal wave of pressure from Denver, Boulder, Colorado Springs, and they want to protect their way of life. And so under those circumstances, you can all those groups say, okay, how can we conserve our public lands so they're not dramatically changed by this wave of recreation pressure? And it's been extremely rewarding, to think about how to draft that legislation, how to strategize to get members interested, members of Congress interested, mayors, county commissioners, but also just to spend the time to recognize that, in my experience is Americans really have a lot in common when it comes to loving their public lands. And people love them for different reasons. Some people love them because they offer a lot of gold and silver for free. Some people love them for off-road vehicle opportunities, but they really are something special and, from my perspective, worth spending a career on.
Well, thanks, Scott. And I'm actually going to jump in here. And,
I'll skip. We'll just have questions, I think.
Yeah, let's go ahead. So I want to be sensitive to folks' time, and people need to go to class and whatever. And so we'll be sure to we'll be sure to end on time.
Don't worry about it.
But that being said, folks have questions for the panel. If it's for a specific person, go ahead and let us know. Or if it's just broadly for the panel, let me know, and I'll just call on folks.
And we'll be here after. We have the room is free, so if people don't have class next and you want to save your question for then, if someone has to go to class in a few minutes, maybe those people go first, just in case, right? Because we have the room after for a little bit.
We do have the room, so yeah, we'll have a formal yes, you can get up and go if you need to now. Yeah. We won't make you creep out, but if you want to stay and chat with the speakers, we're going to be doing that. All right, questions? Okay, Kat.
This is just kind of a broad everyone question. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about how you balance what I would call macro versus micro environmental concerns on public lands. We have a vast need for renewable energy, and public lands are a big space that we talk about developing those kinds of projects, but the implications for wildlife and for other kind of conservation interests are often in conflict with those. So how have you dealt with that?
Well, maybe this is something that, 10 years ago, you asked me if we had a case dealing with the lithium mine. I'm like, what's lithium? Oh, it's in your cell phone. Okay. But now, like, we were fighting the biggest lithium mine proposals in the country. And so people said, oh, how can you environmentalists fight a lithium mine? You want coal mining? Like, no, but, you got to comply with all these public land laws. Native American sacred sites, federal public land law, they're predicted to pollute the groundwater. And so there's better ways to do certain types of mining than others. And so you just have to, if they're going to have this type of, macro issue, that are we just going to waive all the public land laws for lithium? No, I don't think so. That's up. Congress could, and they're trying to do that. And so you do have to pay attention to the macro. I read the news every day, all the environmental publications. You probably get free subscriptions as law students, E&E News and stuff like that. So you got to pay attention to the macro. But eventually, at least for the litigation, you're probably more macro stuff because you deal with these large landscapes. But mine's like, it's this pot of land that we're trying to protect, or this stream. And so then you get into the micro, gets into the litigation, but the policy issues you definitely have to be aware of when you do litigation. And then you're more policy than obviously than the litigation and stuff.
Yeah, I'd say, just add, public lands are supposed to be managed in the public interest. And I think, different people have a different sense of what the public interest is, but I always think about that. You have a different perspective if you're working for the Interior Department or the United States Senate or the Wilderness Society. But we really have to keep an eye on the macro while we're making the micro work. Renewable energy is a great example. I mean, a solar project, industrial solar project is more destructive than oil and gas for those lands. But we think about climate change.
Okay, cool. So, seems like it's time to go. Okay, there's a lot of opportunities at CU, and I'm going to bring your focus to the scholarships and fellowships. This is all also on the GWC website. You would be shocked how few people apply for these. These are all environmental law, public land law, energy law, water law. There's one there for you. So please, we'll send up a follow-up email, but there's a lot out there in public lands. Thank you for coming. If you'd like to stay and chit-chat, ask more questions, please do. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, and applause for the speakers. Yeah! Great job. We really appreciate you coming out. Thank you so much.
We should applaud after oral argument.
Why did they do that?